So for the people online, I just started the recording. So if just to let you know that we're going to record this session. So, and we're getting started now. So, there you go. Hello. You want to get go ahead. Okay. So we Rush was back here to put out more chairs if we needed it, but I think there's still a lot of people down there talking away, and so they'll probably come in later, but we're going to get started now. So I'm Larry Strasser, and this is Rush Pierce, and together we lead the Christian Education Adult Forum. And today we're just really excited to have this panel on and when we started this, by the way, the leak had not yet occurred from the Supreme Court. So don't think that like we had we planned this after the leak. No, this has been months in preparation, and Emily is the driving force behind this. So anyway, I'd like to introduce Emily, and then we'll start our talks. So Emily Holdman is a longtime member of First Plymouth, new to the CE ministry this year. She was on the selection committee that brought Jenny here. And that was written before last night. Okay. And she has sung in the choir for 12-ish or so years with maternity leaves and last COVID year. She has a BA in biochemistry from Colorado College and an MS in nutrition from the University of Utah, and is a registered dietitian nutritionist. Prior to becoming a full-time mom in 2013, she worked doing health and nutrition research at the University of Colorado Health and Wellness Center. So please welcome Emily. As I said before, she is the one who's the driving force behind this this panel. So please, Emily.
Is it recording?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's already recording.
Okay.
Yes. See, it's recording.
Yep.
And so I'm going to share your.
I'll let them figure out the presentations. Thank you all for coming.
Choose the application.
And as
Okay, we'll have to do that first. Now we can go down to
Okay.
share.
as Rush and Larry said, we sort of had this idea to do this, I think, probably November or December, back when the Supreme Court was
Okay.
going to hear
And
the
then go
Mississippi
full screen,
case. That we are
This is where we
now
screwed up last time.
anticipating and have a fairly good idea of what will happen because of this leak. But it has made my life easier to explain to you why I think we needed to have a forum about abortion. I feel like every other news story I hear has talked about it lately. So just to get started, I am going to run through a few statistics and things about abortion, especially in Colorado. How do I advance slides? There we go. Okay. And then we have a panel of experts that I got a lot of help from contacts, finding and things like that. Unfortunately, one of my panelists emailed last night that she was not feeling well enough to be able to make it. So we will only have two speakers, Kevin Paul, who is general counsel to Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains for almost 3 decades. And that means you know a lot. And Markeisha Lawrence Scott, who a lot of us know, and we're excited to hear from her. And then our other panelist is still here. I do not have power at my house, so I was not able to do a lot of editing and resending of my slides last night. So it'll just be the two of them, and then we will take questions at the end. So if everybody could save questions. Okay. So this data that I have is pulled from the abortion surveillance from the CDC. They collect data from around the country, but it is voluntary. So as you can see, one of the major exclusions is California. For some reason, California does not report their data to the CDC. And the most recent year that we have is 2019. I will be surprised if there ever is any data from 2020 and 2021. But as you can see, abortion rates have been falling steadily, and that holds true for the last decades. The highest point for abortions in this country were the early 80s. shortly after the decision in 1973 for Roe v. Wade was made. And then I pulled out just some specific Colorado statistics to get a look at what abortion looks like in Colorado. So in 2019, there were 9,002 abortions. And if you want to look at that in a little bit more concrete way, that's 7.6 per 1,000 women of childbearing age, 15 to 44.
I'm going, go ahead.
And
Get out of your way.
what's going on here? And 100 or 143 per 1,000 live births. So that's just another way to think about it. And about 10.5% were out of state residents. And I put that in there because now that number has grown because of the Texas decision. I know there were a lot of women coming from Texas to Colorado. And if the leaked ruling holds, we will become a destination in sort of the West for abortion. So that number will increase drastically. And then here's a breakdown by age, just for interest's sake. The majority of abortions are women in their 20s-ish. And then about 20% married, 80% unmarried. The CDC does not give any data about ethnicity, demographics, or anything like that. So that is not something I can pass on to you. At weeks of gestation, and the biggest thing to note here, which makes sense, is that over 90% of all abortions happen in the first trimester, so before the 13th week of pregnancy. And I can tell you just from anecdotal knowledge and experience, abortions that are happening beyond that are never undertaken lightly. They're almost always either really serious things going on with the mother's health or really serious things going on with the fetus. I feel like some of the abortion opponents love to focus on those later term abortions and things like that. Those are not things that happen commonly and are not things that happen flippantly in almost all cases. And then there are now two common methods of doing abortions. The surgical method, which is most common kind of in the later first trimester of pregnancy, but medical abortions is now over, and that's the medication combination. So it's two different pills, two medications, FDA approved to happen up through 9 weeks of pregnancy, but that is over half of all abortions that are happening. And that it's probably much higher now because through the pandemic, the FDA relaxed their rules and allowed those pills to be mailed without usually with telehealth appointments, not in-person appointments. So I would bet that medication abortions are even higher now. And that will become a huge focus if this leaked ruling stands. Let's see what else. Oh, this one I pulled out because in all of the news stories that I've been hearing lately, they often talk about who is getting abortions in this country. And the main things that they talk about are that they're minorities, they're in their 20s, they're unmarried, they usually have other children. And I was a little bit surprised that Colorado actually does not follow that trend. If you can see here, well over half of all abortions are women who have never had children before. And I pulled out just some other states to give you a comparison. So if you look at the numbers for 1 and 2 children, they're usually higher than the 0, but not in Colorado. And I don't really know why we're different, but that caught my eye just as something to note. Let's see. Is that all I have? Oh, and then this is my last slide that I will talk about. I pulled this off of the Guttmacher Institute, which I will talk about a little bit more at the end for further information. But with the impending Supreme Court decision, all the states in orange will certainly or most likely ban abortion, and it will greatly change the landscape of abortion in this country. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, which is Kevin Paul. And while Rush switches over our presentation here, for nearly 3 decades, Kevin Paul has served as general counsel to Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains. Along the way, he has challenged restrictions on abortion care in the courts, in state capitals, and in state ballot initiative campaigns. Kevin will offer some thoughts on the history of reproductive health care law and on how that law may change in the wake of the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is the Mississippi case that they heard in December that is now all abuzz in the news. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Kevin.
Good morning. Good morning. Nice to see everyone. I'm gonna wait for the technical team here.
There we go.
There we go. I'm gonna turn this a little bit, so maybe the folks on the call don't have to just look at my head all afternoon. So as Emily said, I'm a lawyer. I usually start by apologizing for that. And I've been at it a while. I am the first attorney to have been hired as an in-house general counsel by an affiliate of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood Federation of America, as you know, is a great big organization that reaches way back to the beginning of this century. It has a very special relationship with Colorado, and then Margaret Sanger, our founder, had a great friend here named Judge Ben Lindsay, who he's pretty much credited for having established the idea of juvenile law, of treating young people differently than adults in our court system. And he also was very, very active in working to see that the contraception was available to all who wanted to use it. In fact, if you drive downtown, there's a great big courthouse. It's very contemporary with an interesting sculpture that looks like leaves on the front of it. And that courthouse is named the Lindsay Flanagan Courthouse for Judge Lindsay. And if you go inside, inscripted on the wall is his story, and it actually talks about his support for contraception, which is one of the ways that I'm very proud to say Colorado is different than all those other states that were surrounding us on Emily's map. That we have a long history here of acknowledging, respecting, and protecting the right to choose. So Emily asked me to just talk to you a little bit about the history of abortion and in the law, in particular, our jurisprudence around it. I have friends from Europe who always laugh at me when I say, we have abortion law. And it's like, you guys have to have a law about sex. We got that worked out sometime. But the answer is, yes, we do. And I've been around this for a little while. We're going to reach back, I think, just to World War II and talk about the fact that before World War II, in the 20s and 30s, if you lived in an urban area and you were a person of means, nothing's changed about the fact that poverty has a lot to do with whether you have access to care or not. Abortion care is no different than the rest of medical care. But if you lived in an urban area and you could afford it, you could probably find your way to a person who could provide a safe abortion, medically safe. Either a physician or a midwife. Now, if you lived in a rural area, you were out of luck for the most part. But even though most states had some sort of criminal sanction formally on the books with respect to abortion, they didn't really enforce it very, very much until after World War II. And we all know the history of our country, especially during the 50s, kind of swinging toward Eisenhower conservatism and all that kind of stuff. And more often, physicians were actually confronted with being prosecuted, often in the Deep South, for providing abortion care. And what that caused was the phenomenon that really spurred a lot of change in our law beginning in the 1960s, and that is that women began showing up in emergency departments, either hemorrhaging from a perforation of the uterus owing to the unskilled manipulation of a surgical instrument, or in septic shock. As you know, when you introduce things inside the body, like into the uterus, that are not sterile, that's a great place to introduce the kind of infection that explodes. And often, more and more often, during the 1950s and early 1960s, women were dying from what came to be known as back alley abortions that were not performed in medically safe circumstances. That led a group of folks called the American Law Institute It's an organization primarily of law professors, but also practitioners like me and judges that work to make sure that our state legislatures and our courts are well aware of certain legal principles. They're sort of like an encyclopedia of law in our country. And in 1962, the American Law Institute issued what it called its model penal code. It's a bunch of criminal statutes, and one of the things they addressed was abortion care. And they said, you know, we need to think about this because people are getting hurt. And so they suggested that states adopt an exception to the general prohibition against providing abortions. Almost all states that had any kind of statute said you cannot provide an abortion unless the woman's going to die if she continues her pregnancy, including the state of Texas, which we'll come back to in a second. But the American Law Institute said, well, why don't we do this? Let's require that there be a treating physician who makes this decision. The treating physician has to have a consulting physician to provide a second opinion to make sure we're right, that there is a grave danger to the woman carrying the pregnancy to her mental or physical health if she continues the pregnancy, or there is a high likelihood that the fetus she is carrying, if she carries it to birth, will be born with a grave defect of some sort. She has a fetal anomaly of some sort. The other reason that they gave for allowing abortion would be in the case of rape or incest. Now, states all over the place in the mid-1960s in particular started taking a look at the American Law Institute suggestion, and it is well recognized that Colorado's General Assembly was the first state legislature to adopt an exception to its abortion law in line with the American Law Institute. It was run in the legislature. I tell stories about the legislature. I'm like your worst nightmare. Not just a lawyer, I'm also a registered lobbyist. And I run political campaigns as a campaign finance guy. So I'm like Darth Vader. All right, all your worst nightmares. 1967, then freshman Representative Dick Lamb, who became our governor, ran a bill and managed to get it through with Republican votes. The Governor Love was a Republican. Things were different in those days. As Emily was pointing out, that map that you saw is indicative of the fact that abortion is no longer something that people cross political lines to talk about. I probably know what you think based upon who you told me you voted for president. Not all the time, but things have changed a lot. In fact, they've changed since I started working in the Capitol here in Colorado. I used to count Republican votes to block anti-choice legislation in the Colorado State House and State Senate. Great Senator Dottie Wong, who represented the area out by Golden and Lakewood, Republican. She was the grandmother of the Senate. And if you were going to try to run an anti-choice bill, you had to run it through her. And she didn't give way easily. That's not the way it works in our legislature anymore. But we led the way. Other states followed. Even by the time that we turned the calendar into the 1970s, in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention issued a resolution indicating that while the church did adhere to the idea that life began at conception, it also was willing to take the position that the American Law Institute factors were right, and that we should recognize an exception to the blanket prohibition of abortion in our state laws. The Southern Baptist Convention. That means a lot to me because I'm a kid from Texas. I grew up in the 60s in Austin and in Dallas. My father was a Presbyterian minister. First Presbyterian church in Dallas as of 1969. And back then, that statute in Texas that only permitted abortion when a woman's life was at risk was still the law. And he took part in an organization called Clergy Consultation Services. It was a consortium of Christian ministers, Roman Catholic priests, more nuns than priests, rabbis, who in the dark of night would transport women to then illegal but medically safe abortions. And The doctor that he worked most often with was the doctor. So I went to my first Planned Parenthood clinic when I was 11 years old. My father and my stepmother actually worked for the affiliate in North Dallas. And so I kind of kicked around this stuff for a while. Like I said, it just means I'm old. But times have changed. 1970, a young Texas lawyer named Linda Coffey wrote the famous $15 check to the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Texas in Dallas and started the case called Roe versus Wade. You don't hear about Linda very much. She was kind of quiet and introverted. She was a bankruptcy lawyer. She had been a judicial clerk for Judge Sarah T. Hughes. Some of you, you're old enough to remember that iconic picture of President, then Vice President Johnson standing in Air Force One with his hand up, Lady Bird on one side holding the Bible, and Jackie Kennedy next to him, in the awful pink suit with the blood stains. And the woman whose head, this sort of like the folks are looking at me, whose head was to the camera, was Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who Linda Coffey worked for. When she filed the lawsuit back in those days, in a constitutional challenge, she got a 3-judge panel in the district court. There's no decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit about Roe versus Wade, because we had a different procedure. And guess who got chosen for the 3-judge panel? Judge Sarah T. Hughes. We got things done now in Texas back in those days. Much more famous is Sarah Weddington, who Linda Coffey brought into the case after it got started. They were law school classmates at the University of Texas in the late 1960s. Sarah Weddington became a very prominent Texas politician, as well as a famous lawyer. She passed away just last year, in fact. She served in the Texas State House with my great uncle, who also served in the State House with Sarah T. Hughes. Things kind of go around, come around. They represented a woman named Norma McCordy, who is or was Jane Roe. Norma McCordy was about 21 years old. She was homeless. She was pregnant. They connected with her through another lawyer that was friends with Linda and determined that they didn't really worry too much about who the plaintiff was. This was the thing about legal consequences and legal principles. Nobody really planned on Norma McCordy becoming as prominent as she did. And if you know anything about her life, it was a hard one. She decided that she wanted to take the other position from pro-choice for a while and then kind of flipped back and forth. And she died not that long ago in 2017.
So Kevin, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. Can you stand just a little closer to the
I sure
screen
can.
so the people at home can hear better? So,
I'll be glad to. Apologize for moving around. It's kind of an occupational hazard. The lawyers union doesn't like us to stand still. Roe versus Wade, as I said, went through the U.S. District Court in Texas and straight to the U.S. Supreme Court on a certiorari because the state of Texas didn't like the answer they got from the U.S. District Court, which is that the Texas abortion control statute could not be enforced. It was unconstitutional. Once it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, it was a weird case too. It got argued twice because of changes in the court's personnel. Justices leaving and coming on to the court. Ultimately, Justice Harry A. Blackmun was the justice who was assigned to write the opinion. Who appointed Justice Blackmun? Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon. And Justice Blackmun was identified all of his career as a member of the Independent Republican Party of the state of Minnesota. He also, before he was appointed to the bench, served as general counsel to the Mayo Clinic, one of the great healthcare institutions in our country, and he never made any secret of his reverence for the physicians that he represented as general counsel for the Mayo Clinic. Roe versus Wade, the decision was issued on a Monday morning in 1973. The court actually meets for what it calls opinion days on Mondays at 10 o'clock. The decision in Roe versus Wade was leaked by Time magazine. Went on newsstands at 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. It's sort of ironic. Now, I was talking to Emily
But it
before.
had been decided.
It had been decided. It certainly had. About the fact that when I finished law school at the University of Minnesota, I had the great good fortune to be appointed judicial clerk for Justice Esther Tomjanovich of the Minnesota Supreme Court. And we had the fear of God put into us about maintaining the confidentiality of everything that we did at the court, everything. It didn't matter whether it was mom, dad, your wife, your husband, your brother, your sister, you did not talk about the work that was done because the judges, the justices on the Minnesota Supreme Court, much like the justices of the US Supreme Court, they think in writing. They think out loud in writing. They don't walk down the hall and talk to each other very much because they got all kinds of stuff to do. So I didn't read the draft of Justice Alito's opinion because I was so offended by the fact that that had been released. And I felt like I wasn't supposed to see it in the first place. I wasn't gonna read it, and I didn't. I got an idea, but I didn't read it. What Roe versus Wade said is three things. How many of you read the opinion? Roe versus Wade. You've read it? Good, that's cool.
It's been a while.
Yeah. Everybody has an opinion about it, but nobody's read it. Right? Justice Blackmun, you should read it. You should read it. It doesn't matter what happens in the next few days, weeks, whenever. It's like a poem. It's a poem about the healers, the people who take care of us. It really is. It's a beautiful exegesis on physicians and on medical care and on the importance of that physician-patient relationship and how nobody should get in the way of that. Justice Blackmun was famous for having pulled up in the Mayo Clinic library to study the history of abortion. And he wrote most of the factual part of the decision. He had a chief law clerk that had most of the laws. The three things that it says is, number one, the life and health of a woman carrying a pregnancy who wants to terminate it through abortion are paramount. No matter what else we think about, what other interests there may be, that has to be the number one. The top thing, the woman's life and health. Number two, the state may have an interest in encouraging childbirth over abortion. In Roe versus Wade, the majority said that interest becomes more important the further you go into pregnancy. In what was measured in the Roe versus Wade, the first trimester of pregnancy, the state really had no interest to speak of and could not regulate abortion care such that it made it difficult or even impossible for a woman to secure. In the second trimester, that interest began to take hold, and in the third trimester, it became strong enough that the state could prohibit abortion altogether, which a bunch of states had done, including Texas, including Colorado. The only way they could do that, however, was to go back to number one. There had to be an exception to the prohibition against abortion where an abortion was necessary to protect the health or the life of the woman carrying the pregnancy. And finally, the whole decision turns on a very important concept. It's in footnote 52. And it's where Justice Blackmun said a fetus, a developing embryo, which we talk about up to about 8 weeks, and beyond that, a fetus is not a person. Not a person for purposes of the US Constitution. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, you may remember from those glorious days of yesteryear when you were in high school civics and you took that one political science class that made you decide, I want to study science. And what Justice Blackmun said is, it doesn't work if we say that a fetus is a person and a woman is a person. Because what happens now? Under the 14th Amendment, the states are not permitted to deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. If a woman and a fetus are evened up in terms of their interests, what happens to the right to abortion? It goes away. What Roe versus Wade stands for at its very root is that the scales are never even. woman's interests are always heavy. They're always the predominant concern. That's what Roe told us. And that is the law today. Now, in the years following Roe, almost as soon as the ink got dry on the opinion, states started trying to cut away at the right that the Supreme Court had announced in that case, coming up with all kinds of things to get in the way of a woman being able to obtain an abortion. Things like waiting periods, 24, 48, 72 hours. It's not unusual now, especially in the South. What we call misinformed consent, telling women that there is a greater chance that you will develop breast cancer if you have an abortion, which is just hooey. It isn't there. It is not supported by anything in the medical literature. And yet there are states that have adopted and been permitted to keep that regulation in place. Parental notice and parental consent. We only have 2 restrictions on abortion care in Colorado, and one of them is a requirement that 48 hours before performing an abortion, a physician or a healthcare provider must send notice to a young person's parent, one or both parents, through the mail. And by young person, I mean anybody who's under 18 years old. There is an exception to that, which is called a judicial bypass. If a young woman cannot talk to her parents because they'll throw her out of the house, because they'll beat her, all kinds of reasons, I don't need a catalog for you, she has to start a lawsuit. She has to come find me. We go down to the Lindsay Flanagan courthouse, and I sit right there on the bench underneath the thing about Judge Lindsay and wait for my client to show up. Although most of the time, I don't care how early I get to court, she's there. Like, where have you been? Waiting. And we go stand in front of the judge to prove that this young woman is mature enough to make the decision herself without her parents' involvement, or even if she isn't, that it's in her best interest to have the abortion without parental involvement. And almost every time the judges will look at that young woman and say, you are more mature than 90% of the other people that I see in my courtroom. You found it, you figured out you were pregnant, you got a hold of somebody to help you figure out what you needed to do about it, you made a decision, you went and found a lawyer, you got down here, and by the way, I know you were here 20 minutes ahead of time, and then you stood up in front of me and explained to me what was going on. And by golly, you're as mature as anybody I've ever seen. I hate that process, and you got to understand, I'm an advocate, I'm a litigator. I don't come at this objectively. I have a position, if you haven't been able to tell already. I hate that law, but by and large, we've been able to work with it in order to make sure that young people can have an abortion if they need it. Now, as Emily pointed out, you saw that map. I've done judicial bypass hearings now with people in Kansas and in Georgia and in Florida that we have to do virtually because
Here's what I found.
they're coming. Don't worry about that. They're coming here. All right, so other restrictions that states have been doing. This all led to the case that if you watched the oral argument in the Dodds case, you heard a lot about the Casey, Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey. It was the one we thought was going to overturn Roe versus Wade. Justice Marshall had left the court and was replaced by Justice Thomas. The numbers didn't look good. At best, we were thinking, it's 4-4 with one that we don't know about, Justice Kennedy. And it was about 3 restrictions on abortion care in Pennsylvania. One was a waiting period. One was the sort of misinformed consent that we talked about. Actually, there's a 4th parental consent, not parental notification, but the parent actually has to consent in Pennsylvania. There's a judicial bypass, but it's consent. And the last was spousal consent. Yeah. Now, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor is widely thought to have been pro-choice. The only restriction on abortion she ever voted to strike down was spousal consent. I met her husband, I think I understand. That came down in 1992, and it changed Roe versus Wade a little bit. It said, man, we're not going to do this trimester stuff anymore. Instead, we're going to draw the line at fetal viability. And what's fetal viability? Now,
It's 23.
It's what a doctor says it is. We do not, in our law right now, there's no Supreme Court decision that says a state can draw a line at a particular time. That's the law today. That's the law today. It replaced Justice Blackmun's test with this thing called the undue burden substantial obstacle test. Basically, it said a state during the period before viability, and viability is the point at which the fetus could live outside the woman's body with or without extraordinary measures, life-sustaining measures. Before that time, the state cannot unduly burden the woman's choice to terminate her pregnancy by throwing up a substantial obstacle to it. So that was the backdrop against which Justice O'Connor said, well, parental consent, that's not a substantial obstacle. Parents have the right to know what their kids are doing. 24-hour waiting period, that's not a substantial obstacle. You just got to wait. You have to go twice to the health center because of that 24-hour waiting period. But spousal consent, that's a substantial obstacle. And finally, in Casey, the court said, Justice Blackmun wasn't quite right about the state's interest. It attaches at the beginning of pregnancy, but it doesn't conflict with a woman's interest in terminating her pregnancy. Right? We were all surprised. We thought Roe versus Wade was going to be reversed in the Casey decision, and instead, the three justices who wrote the opinion, Justice Souter, Justice O'Connor, and Justice Kennedy, concluded that the fundamental holding in Roe versus Wade was affirmed. Now, what they meant by the fundamental holding, you heard in the oral argument, there's about 9 different versions of it right now. And I'll talk in just a second about how the Chief Justice did that. We only had 2 other real abortion-related cases in the US Supreme Court since Casey in the 90s, and that were the 2 were the Carhart cases, and they both had to do with this political notion, it's not medical, called partial birth abortion. It's not in the medical literature. People came up with it out of whole cloth. The first case that was decided in 2000 was about the state of Nebraska having passed a statute that said partial birth abortion is illegal. You can't do it. You're committing a crime if you do. And there was no exception to protect the woman's health. It only wouldn't apply if she was going to die. And it went to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court did what we all knew they were going to do. They said, you can't do that. Since Roe versus Wade, health, a woman's health, mental and physical, tracking right back to that American Law Institute model penal code that we talked about from 1962. That's always been the law. And we're not going to change it, except when we get an injustice on the court. And we felt the balance. And in 2007, the second Carhart case, and Carhart's a doctor in Nebraska, Dr. Carhart, had to do with the federal government passing a prohibition against so-called partial birth abortion, no health exception. And the Supreme Court said, you can do that. You can do that. In a decision written by Justice Kennedy, that is one of the most offensive and disgusting pieces of judicial literature I've ever read. It basically takes the position that women cannot be trusted to have the mental fortitude to make the decision themselves. And I challenge you, if you don't believe me and think I'm overstating it, go read that opinion. The day it came out, my colleague in my law firm, who was a very young lawyer in her first year with us, literally screamed when she read it. It's that bad. As good as Roe versus Wade was, that Carhart decision is awful. All right, so everybody, I'll finish up. I know you want to ask what I think is going to happen. First of all, clean up a rumor. My phone lit up today because somebody went to the US Supreme Court website and saw that if you go there, there's a calendar. And the calendar tells tells you what the judges are doing and what the court does. Mondays, as I said when we started, are opinion days. They have a little yellow box around them. And if you look at the calendar that's posted right now, tomorrow is the last opinion day of this term, which ends on July the 3rd. They also have these blue boxes called non-argument days, and there's 4 of them left in June. And they use those at the end of the term to issue opinions as well. So is it gonna come out tomorrow? Maybe. They kind of do what they want to do, but I wouldn't get all bent out of shape about it. We all know what's gonna happen. I mean, the folks who got appointed to do this, right? I was fortunate enough when I was in my undergraduate work to first of all be a research assistant and then to be the co-author of the second edition of a book called American Judicial Politics. It talks about the fact that if you think courts aren't political entities, you need to go back to that civics class. They are, we know that. They all answered the question, sitting there in the White House. I think we're gonna see a decision, a majority decision for 5. We know the 3 Trump appointees, and we know that Justice Thomas and Justice Alito have made it clear, not just in that draft, but in other decisions, that they do not believe that the due process clause, the 14th Amendment, the liberty prong of the due process clause includes federal protection for abortion and for the decision to terminate a pregnancy through abortion. The Chief Justice, as Emily and I were kind of jawing about before, I believe he'll write his own decision. He will do what's called concurring in the result, but not in the reasoning. He'll conclude that the 15-week line is okay in Mississippi, but it's okay because it's not a substantial obstacle. And that the viability line, as he pointed to in his very pointed questions to my colleague who argued in the Supreme Court, the viability line could move. And the key to the test is the undue burden created by a substantial obstacle. And you saw the numbers that Emily put up there. 90% of abortions occur before that 15-week line. Now, I'm arguing the other side's case. I'm just saying, I think that's where the chief's going to go, in part because he is an institutionalist with respect to the court. He cares about the court very, very, very much. He also cares about that 450-page biography that's going to sit in the Library of Congress. Not quite wanting to be the justice, the Chief Justice who oversaw the US Supreme Court turning its back on the desires of 2/3 of the people in our country. Okay. And then there'll be 3 dissents. I think they'll all write separately and they'll all join each other. Probably read them from the bench. I think it would make sense that Justice Breyer would have his final opportunity to speak from the bench and would do so in this case, which I know the way that it's going, it really does violate some of his first principles about what the judiciary is supposed to do. So I have yammered at you for long enough. I'll be violating the 8th Amendment. You remember which one that is? The cruel and unusual punishment. If I don't stop, I'm going to be going over the line. My colleague Markeisha is up next and going to talk about stuff that's actually a lot more interesting than I was talking about.
Very interesting.
Our next speaker, Markeisha Lawrence Scott, is an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. She will speak from the perspective of how religion and spirituality play a role in personal and socio-political issues such as abortion. So with that, Markeisha.
We're trying to get us to some questions. Very interesting. So I did not know this because I was with you, we're mothers, right? And we're like, oh yeah, 23, 24 weeks of viability. And you're saying, no, the law is that whenever the doctor says, which that makes sense because I had a baby 18 months ago, 18 months and 2 weeks. And when I was at my 28th week, the nurse said, here is a special number that if you have any questions, then you call us. So it's like a little back channel for when they really believe that your baby is viable. And I was like, what would I have done yesterday? When you gave me this, you know, because that's the moment that they said that this is a go. We will really step in for you at this 28th week. But in my head, because of all of the resources, it was 24 weeks, right? 23 weeks. And so now that makes so much more sense. I just had that epiphany there. And because I also have I have an MSW, but also an MDiv, I use words like epiphany. Okay, so and I'll just say a little bit of my positionality. I am a professor at DU at the social work school, and social work is a little bit different than divinity, but I did go to Eden Theological Seminary, so one of the UCC seminaries. So I think that we probably have some things in common. I also am the wife of Reverend Anthony Scott, and I am a mother. So that's who I am. And so I take this approach around abortion as a couple of things. It is complex, it is nuanced, and it is personal, right? And so I think that while there is, there's law that gives us all these rules, but it also highlights, it is complex, nuanced, personal, right? And so a lot of the conversations that we have around abortion oftentimes are trying to get down to the one exact specific answer. It has to be this exact way. And a lot of times when I'm having these conversations with people, I will say, well, what are we talking about? What is the argument in this case that you're making right now? And a lot of times people are making medical arguments, not theological or personal ones. So here we go, sorry. And so what we talked a little bit before about medical abortions, right? It's about the safety. And so these are highly personal. And here's a quote from the Mayo Clinic. You can choose medical abortion to complete an early miscarriage or end an unwanted pregnancy. You can also choose to have a medical abortion if you have a medical condition that makes continuing a pregnancy life-threatening. So this conversation with a medical doctor is a very specific conversation. And so even the Mayo Clinic is saying, here's a couple of different reasons that we could do that and how we can focus there. And then there's legal, which we got, I feel like I went to law school today. I was supposed to be a lawyer, but I didn't have the gut, yeah. And so, so one of the conversations is there were over 600, almost 630,000 legal abortions, right? Which gives us an implication that there are somehow some illegal ones, right? If we are calling out this conversation. And so are we talking about the illegality of the abortion? Or are we talking about medical? So a lot of times people are talking about different things. There's also this economic reason, right? We talk about who has these abortions, and most of the time they'll talk about who it is. Oftentimes people who are low income, people who are low income are 5 times more likely to have abortions for many reasons. One of the reasons that we saw this past week is that our country will show you over and over again that we will let you and your children starve, right? Because there are reasons that you can't get this certain resource. There's reason that you can't get that. And so if you are really in a dire situation, this could really become as high as a medical concern for a person, right? And particularly around women who are not in charge of their finances. And so if you are a woman who aren't in charge of your finances or your fertility, you're a woman in trouble, right? And so this is a conversation that we have that kind of leans into this economic space. And I think that will get us to a more theological conversation as well. There's also the conversation around wellness of a person. So if you ever have a little small child, even on your best day, you're like, I think I'm losing this thing. I'm going to bed. I'm not going to say I lost, but I didn't win, right? And so, but this lack of access, and you think about the stigma that comes around it, but also if people have concerns around their mental health and their overall wellness, having a baby takes a lot out of a person. And not just those 9 months, you're taking another 18 months trying to just get basic nourishment back, right? Hair is falling out, all these kind of things happen. I had a couple of moles. I was like, is it skin cancer? They're like, oh no, you had a baby. It kind of changes things like that. So I'm like, what? That wasn't on the list. But your overall wellness is greatly impacted. And so then we have these conversations that are religious. Right. And I'm so sad that Emily Salzman wasn't going to be here today, but she is Jewish and she does reproductive justice work. And in the Jewish tradition, until that first breath, the ruach, right, there is no life. Right. And so this conversation is very different from a religious perspective in a Jewish tradition, because they don't have to go into the law. It is in their culture, in their religion, it is there. And so because in a lot of Christian traditions for us, we have differing views in our own tradition, but also we have a little bit of law and politics in our religion. a little bit more, just a little bit, right? And so that these conversations look a little different. And so depending on the religion, the fetal life and fetal development means a little something different, right? And so, but this space, a theological space, which I don't have quotes or statistics for, but one of the things that I would like for us to kind of open our conversations around is the idea of how do we talk about this from a theological perspective, not religious, medical, legal, right? The theological perspective is one of a conversation. It is what do we know? It is a study of how we interact with God, how the people have a conversation with the divine. And so one of the things that we have in our hands is the gospel, the good news, glad tidings, right? So what is the good news for someone who I've mentioned is a woman in trouble? Is there a balm in Gilead for her, right? What do we have to offer? And so one of the ways that I say, if we're talking about conversations, and there are some religious Christian tradition that would say, here is a scripture that says abortion is not okay. 100%, there are no scriptures that talk about abortion. You can pull them and try to finagle them to be about something else. But a theological perspective, there is none. But what we do have is what we understand and know about God. And so if our God is one who is a punishing God, one who is not compassionate and generous, I would say my God is compassionate, generous, and life-giving, right? And so I would have this conversation around how do we offer the good news to someone in this situation? Because the good news and the gospel should be applicable to every situation, right? And so the other thing that we have from a theological perspective is the human condition. The human condition is that there will always be ebbs and flows, issues in our lives, right? And so a lot of the situations that we run into are oftentimes not because of our own sin or the sins of our parents, but they are just life. And so how do we have a conversation that engages that? And so I'll stop there so that we can begin to have some questions from the people, but I wanted to just kind of offer that. And there's always, if we were in 1997, we probably have little bracelets on saying, what would Jesus do? And so that's probably one of the more applicable questions when we're talking about abortion from a theological perspective. And so I want to sit down and allow folks to ask questions.
Great. Right. So who would like to jump in? We can start on any topic. Anything that you thought of? Yes.
It's been heavily on my mind of how to volunteer in Planned Parenthood. I've talked to my daughter, she's a businesswoman, and other young women that have miles they could donate to get people airline tickets. I mean, we have a lot of thoughts about that in the country where we go to mess up.
So, and Emily, if you could repeat the question.
Oh,
so people
sure.
at home can hear.
The question was about how to volunteer and offer help to Planned Parenthood and other organizations that help women find abortions, even to the point of airline miles to travel here. So,
Yeah, and there are going to be opportunities to do that. Planned Parenthood, the Rocky Mountains.org on the web is a good place to start. There is a very vibrant and deep volunteer program for folks to do all kinds of different things. One of the greatest ways to volunteer is to write a check. I gotta tell you. It is no joke that Colorado and New Mexico, both of which are within the ambit of Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains that I serve, are islands now in a sea of anti-choice legislation, and it's only going to get worse. We know that. And they are in the process of expanding their footprint to push out toward the borders where people are going to be coming so that it's easier to get to the care that they need. Emily mentioned telehealth and medication abortion. We already have states that are passing statutes prohibiting the use of telehealth visits and mailing of medication abortion. And I don't know where that's going. It introduces all kinds of questions about state law. The states typically can govern the care that licensed medical professionals can offer. And so please do look up the website. There are ways to get in touch with the organization, and there will be jobs to do, including donating things like travel expenses. That's a very important part, and they're developing some technological ways to do it.
If I can add one other thing, there's a lot of cities around the country that are considering themselves sanctuary cities. I'm not sure if Denver will be one of them, more in particular, but some of the things, if the spirit of Justice Lindsay holds, then there is opportunity for congregations and individuals to house people, to offer safe space for them when they're coming. And so in collaboration with some other organization, probably like Planned Parenthood, would be a good opportunity to do that. So kind of keeping our eyes out, but it's kind of like waiting and seeing. Just we have to actually wait until it comes out to do that. But
That's underway.
Yeah.
Looking for places that people can stay safely.
And another organization I know that provides things like that is the Cobalt Fund, which Emily was involved with. So that would be another one to look up on their website.
You mentioned that New Mexico is affiliated. In Colorado, they've enshrined the right to an abortion into state law this past legislative session. Has New Mexico done a similar?
Sort of in the breach. 2 years ago, I helped in lobbying a bill that removed the old prohibition against abortion, which had largely been held unconstitutional anyway. We did this in 2013 here. But it has the effect of saying that the public policy in New Mexico is that abortion and reproductive health care are available and should not be regulated. I would look for New Mexico to possibly to pass a similar statute. The politics there are a little funky. And the timing might be a little off for doing that. But as long as, let's see, not supposed to talk about campaigns for public office, so I won't do that and put your tax exempt status at risk. Keep an eye on New Mexico. I think it will continue to be a safe haven for people who are seeking care.
We'll go over here.
I'll keep this kind of open-ended, but my questions around the use of the word life versus personhood. I think the most acute thing is going to be in vitro fertilization issues, because there's an average at least 8 successful fertilized embryo. Let's call them embryos. They're blastocysts, but
yeah,
right.
So I don't know whether there's any comments yet. That gets into language, philosophy, legalese, but
yeah. Markeisha, we were sort of dawned about this earlier, about the notion of life and when it begins, and the theological position that you described.
yeah, so I think that there is this, if we look at particularly in Old Testament, there's a conversation around Ruach, the breath of God, which is basically when a person is able to take their first breath as well, even though that Ruach conversation is normally about God. But that's a whole other thing. We don't have to go into that. But it is oftentimes, so if we were to say, if Christianity is birthed out of Jewish tradition, then the idea of what would Jesus do? Jesus would probably say that the life happens after birth, right? And so when that first breath is taken, because that is the Jewish tradition. In fact, in a culture perspective, a lot of times there is a longer time for naming, a longer time for even connecting with baby, because we have to make sure this baby's going to be around, right? And so even then there's a little bit of distance, but over time, right, we have politicized and also become a little bit more, we've kind of put our own kind of cultural reasons around it. But from a theological perspective, I would say that if we were taking the Jewish tradition from which our tradition stems, is that it will be after birth, that when there is true life. Right? Yeah. But then from this abortion conversation, remember, it is very rare for a baby to be fully developed and there be an abortion, and if there is really great trepidation and lots of issues that are going into it, right? Because remember, 90% of all of the abortions are happening 13, much earlier, 15 weeks before that. Right?
That issue of personhood is very important to the legal perspective that we take. And one of the concerns that I have going forward is a turning away from the notion that a developing human being, there's no doubt that it's a human, but it's developing. If we move to the point of saying that a fetus at some point becomes recognized as a person where those scales even up, then we got a real problem. And I know that you probably remember beginning in 2008, we had ballot initiatives, cycle after cycle. I thought I was never going to get rid of that stuff. And we won decisively in every single one of those elections. They finally gave up and went away. Colorado has several statutory provisions establishing that a fetus is not a person.
And when we think about just, so on the social work side of this, we have lots of support around children. So I'm a mandated reporter. If I even hint that something, since something is happening, I am mandated to report for someone to even look at it, right? But that makes sense for someone that I can physically see that I'm engaging. If I am able to also become a mandated reporter for a baby that's in someone else's uterus, what line have we crossed? I mean, I think that's just a road. I mean, that's just a bridge too far.
It creates all kinds of trouble. I did lots and lots of talks during the personhood ballot initiatives about the 480 different statutes that would be completely screwed up if we started talking about a fetus as a person. I think there was a
For example, right, yeah, thanks. For example, if a fetus is a person, then they can open bank accounts, right? Right? As a minor, right? They can own stock, they can buy a building, right? They can buy a home.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and those are like some of the 500
yes,
laws that would be messed up if
right.
babies inside, and also would they count in the census?
Yes.
Right? So anyway, I think it's ridiculous.
Stage rating at 30 years.
And even to get life insurance, right?
Yeah,
We
that's
borrow life insurance for ourselves and for our baby to put our baby on in our trust and everything. They say you have to wait 14 days.
Yeah,
You have 14 days and get a social security number.
right.
Right? And so if that is, you know what I mean? Like if we're just kind of really being
Very concrete and logical. Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. Susie.
I have a question. As you say, the decision will come down and our side will have lost. What about our freedom of religion? Can we go back and do a First Amendment case?
So it's a very interesting point. And do I need to say what the question was?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So the question was about making a First Amendment case for violating a church like ours freedom of religion that feels so strongly that abortion should be legal in certain cases or all cases or whatever.
And our denomination has said that since 1971, even before
Yeah.
Roe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Justice John Paul Stevens, who was appointed by President Ford and sat on the court until the early 2000s. Often wrote decisions in abortion cases, establishing his theory that the only way you got to regulating abortion in the way that Texas and other states had was by violating the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Because ultimately, it's a decision about when life begins, which is a fundamentally theological decision. And you're imposing that on everybody else. And I am very much in that camp. I'm very comfortable with that argument because I've never been confronted with someone from the side opposite me whose position was not somehow rooted in a theological position.
So couldn't we hire a lawyer to take our case?
I got a fee agreement in the car. I think what that just to finish your thought, you're right. That what's going to happen is now we're going to have to find a different avenue to challenge this stuff, not the 14th Amendment. And if you read the stories about Roe versus Wade, I think there's a piece in the New York Times today in the magazine that talks about the fact nobody thought Roe was going to be the leading case that it became. There were other theories as well as activists who were saying, don't go to court. Let's do this in the legislatures.
Right.
The state legislatures are going the right direction. Colorado led the way. Let's keep going that way so that we don't wind up in the mess we're in now. That's not to criticize Roe. The people who did that case were brilliant and it's protected us a long time. But I think what you'll see is now people trying to figure out a different avenue somehow, some way.
Good.
Yeah. Yep. Next question.
I'd like to give an OB-GYN's perspective to this, if I may.
Excellent.
Speak up, Bob.
Yep.
The American College of OB-GYN is in a real quandary today, discussing its ethical and its moral responsibility to the women for which it has pledged to serve all these years. One of the worst case scenarios that concerns us is in those states such as in Oklahoma and Texas, where a physician can actually be indicted for criminal offense, and in Oklahoma they can go to prison for 20 years for performing an abortion. The way they've written their law, that could also include a physician's attempt to treat a miscarriage, definitely treat an ectopic pregnancy, which is the #1 cause of maternal mortality for women under 20 weeks of gestation, as well as IVF issues. And so a couple of the issues there and options they're considering include #1, creating rescue plans and assistance to physicians to transfer out of those states in which they could face criminal indictment for performing their art or their practice of medicine. Secondly, encourage medical societies and Chamber of Commerce in cities in which they have a desperate need of physicians to entice physicians to leave those states and come to states that do embrace women's rights, and those states also are in desperate need for physicians. Another avenue that's being discussed and considered is to ask the ACGME, which is the accreditation agency of training, to revoke their accreditation of all training programs in those states. Because there is a requirement in training that a physician, OB-GYN, be trained to perform abortions, be trained to treat ectopic pregnancies, trained to treat IVF, as well as to treat miscarriages. So it is also that if they were to enact that, that would be a real turnoff for young people applying to residencies. So those states also would suffer from enticing physicians to practice medicine in their states. And I said, well, what about the innocent people that wouldn't be served? My response to that, and a lot of people in the colleges, if you don't like it, then you better change your state legislatures and you better change your laws if you want physicians to be able to care for you. Because, you know, when we started medical practice, most physicians in the Middle Ages were priests. They weren't married, they weren't attached. But many of our OB-GYN, actually 84% of young people going into residency are women. And those women are young women who've had children of their own. So you're talking about indicting a woman with children in her own home, convicting her and sending her to prison. Even if you don't convict her, she has to pay the legal fees to fight that, because see, malpractice won't covering a physician who is being prosecuted who violates state law. So they cannot fall back on their malpractice insurance to cover them while they're fighting indictment for murder before the court. So those are some of the issues the American College is trying to sort out and the approach that they will ultimately take.
Doctor, I apologize. I should have just sat down and let you talk. And thank you for the work you do.
I've performed 3 abortions in my career. All 3 were medical. All 3 were performed in Baptist hospitals. One was a trisomy 13, which was a condition incompatible with life. Baby is born very dysmorphic if it goes to term, survives about an hour to 2 hours and succumbs. The other two were performed to save the woman's life. In both cases, they were strongly recommended. It's pretty passive. The cardiologists were adamant that these women need to go through an termination because both of them are married, both of them had children, and both of them wouldn't survive the pregnancy. And so those 3 abortions were performed. One, let me just tell you very quickly, to do that, you go through the ethics committee of your hospital. And fortunately, the chaplains corps of many of these hospitals runs the ethics committee, and they were a godsend in guiding the process by which we did this. When we would do this, I did these in training conditions. We exempted any resident or medical student who didn't feel comfortable participating. We also notified the OR staffs of what was about to occur, and they too could excuse themselves from performing these procedures. No one ever stepped aside. The procedures were done in a very reverent, very quiet atmosphere. And they were done before 20 weeks of pregnancy, but sometimes these conditions don't really flourish and become problematic until later pregnancy.
All good points.
Yeah.
And we're very worried about what's going to happen to training,
Yeah.
to graduate medical education, once states start doing this stuff. We don't have an overabundance of abortion care providers now.
All right, well, we're going to take one more question. We're coming up on 1 o'clock here, so.
So this is a legal question. So many of us in this room were in that era before, and so the first week that I was in college, a gal on the floor almost died trying to give herself an abortion to hanging. And then my roommate in junior year, she also almost died by a student whose father was a doctor. And when she was bleeding profusely and they ran to a hospital, the hospital refused her. And we're going back to that time. And then they went to another hospital. Unfortunately, that hospital took her in. So my question is, with what's happening now, will people like that, if a hospital accepts that the physician's working on the person, they didn't perform the abortion, but they're helping at that stage, are there legal ramifications for them?
The legal answer is, I don't know.
That's the last slide.
We're seeing things, as you were pointing out, Doctor, we're headed into uncharted territory. Almost all of us can remember back before Roe, and it was no joke that people were dying from lack of care. And with the state laws, Oklahoma being the most obvious at the moment in our neck of the woods, it has people scared. It has physicians concerned.
Oh my gosh.
And it's not a joke. I am dealing with folks who are saying we're not going to provide anymore until this gets straightened out, because we just can't afford the risk that we would run in doing that. So thank you very much for allowing me to yammer at you.
Yes, thank you all for coming. One last slide for if you want deeper dives into things, or kind of a deeper look than just the cursory news that's been flowing out profusely. The Guttmacher Institute, where I got that map from, their motto is good reproductive health policy starts with credible research. They do a lot of research, and their website is very extensive. They're a globally looking nonprofit. I heard a fascinating podcast. It's NPR's shortwave about the Turnaway study, which is the first study of its kind to focus on physical and social consequences of unwanted pregnancy. Almost all studies look at just mental health, and they compare it, to women who have abortions versus women who don't, and their mental health consequences, and you oftentimes are comparing apples to oranges. And so this was a fascinating, the podcast is really short, but there's a whole book that they just published about this. It was a 10-year study, and it comes out of the University of California, San Francisco. They have a institute called ANSIRH, ANSIRH, Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health. And that's who did that study. And this is the chief researcher's name. Just Friday, I listened to the Ezra Klein Show podcast called The Ethics of Abortion. This one was amazing in talking about in vitro and personhood, and a discussion around that. And the woman who's on it has written 2 books. Kate Grassley, I'm not sure how to say it. So I highly recommend listening to that if you want to think more about these theological and moral issues. And then one plug for my pet interest in all of this was an opinion piece by Jessica Gross at the end of April called "These Laws Are Making Miscarriage More Traumatic in America." And it goes to what Dr. Henderson was talking about, that a lot of this care is how miscarriages are managed as well. And that's not an uncommon happening in this country. 1 in 3 pregnancies end in miscarriage. And a lot of times they do have to be dealt with medically. They don't pass on their own. And that is, another aspect of all of this that's really going to have implications. And I did just see a headline for, I believe it was in the New York Times as well, talking about changes this is going to make just to prenatal health and screenings that happen, and the implications in that, in finding fetal abnormalities. If they can't be treated, what's the point? So that's a whole nother aspect that we were just touching on. So I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to our speakers. I've enjoyed greatly. This lived up to what I was hoping it would be. So thank you. And thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That was really great.
Was he really? Oh my
Very done that for you. I know you've got kind of a bad back. I should have down.
No, it's okay. I got on the wrong knee. I'm better if I got on my left knee. But okay, Lee and Mel, we're going to stop the recording now, and then we're going to shut down the meeting. Thank you for attending.